All right, guys, at the same time, we have an incredible Ryan Grimm and Jeremy Scahill scoop. We can put this up on the screen. They were able to get their hands on a leaked memo from the New York Times that instructed journalists covering Israel's war on Gaza to restrict the use of the terms genocide, ethnic cleansing, and to avoid using the phrases occupied territory when describing Palestinian land, according to a copy of an internal memo obtained by The Intercept. By the way, Saagar, the New York Times apparently just wrapped up their previous investigation into previous leaks to The Intercept.
Yes,
and then
I know.
Right as they wrap that up, The Intercept gets this new, very revelatory leak. The memo also instructs reporters not to use the word Palestine, except in very rare cases, that's a specific language from this memo, to steer clear of the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza historically settled by internally displaced Palestinians who fled from other parts of Palestine during previous wars. The areas, of course, are recognized by the UN as refugee camps and house hundreds of thousands of registered refugees. That one is really significant because this is just such Israeli framing. That this is part of why Israel hates UNRWA so much, is because it gives them the designation of refugees. And, Israel really hates that because they see this as continuing a justified Palestinian claim to the land. So really sort of buying into the Israeli framing here. The Time memo goes on to outline guidance on a range of phrases and terms. They say the nature of the conflict has led to inflammatory language and incendiary accusations on all sides. We should be very cautious about using such language, even in quotations. And they specifically talk about words like slaughter, massacre, and carnage, which they say often convey more emotion than information. Think hard before using them in our own voice, which is funny because The Intercept had previously published an analysis showing that they exclusively use that type of language when it comes to attacks on Israelis. So they found, the Intercept analysis, which we covered here, I think I did a monologue on it actually, showed that major newspapers reserve terms like slaughter, massacre, and horrific almost exclusively for Israeli civilians. New York Times had described Israeli deaths as a massacre on 53 occasions, and those of Palestinians just once. The ratio for the use of slaughter was 22-1, even as the documented number of Palestinians at that time was around 15,000. They also go on to talk about the use of the word terrorism. So they don't characterize Israel's repeated attacks on Palestinian civilians as terrorism, but go on at great length to explain how it is appropriate to call Hamas militants on October 7th terrorists, but the similar attacks on civilians from the Israelis, not terrorism. It's just very, it's very illustrative of the double standards that are applied throughout the news media, and to see it all written out like this is pretty extraordinary.
Right, and here's the thing. If you don't ever want to use the claim genocide, fine, don't use it. But when I Google Russia, genocide, Ukraine, NYT, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories just in the last year that have been published by the New York Times.
That pop right up on your first Google search results.
Very first thing, right? And if I read about terrorism and Russia, what's the same thing? This is, again, like if you want to say, well, it's terrorism because it's a non-state actor, okay, cool. But whenever here we have a actual nation state, Russia, they're accusing them, quote, of terrorism inside of Ukraine. Now it's all subjective and it's editorial and it's based upon the foreign policy views of the owners of the New York Times or the people who work at the New York Times. And that is why it's egregious and why it is stupid.
Yeah.
Now, if you are a political person and you are trying to make these points, that's one thing. But if you're supposedly a newspaper of record and a credible news organization that is actually trying to present some sort of picture of the truth, that's a totally different one. And it is very clear here that for some reason, they have decided to commit themselves entirely to presenting a view of the conflict. And at a certain point, I think it's okay, but then they need to just be honest about where they are and not pretend that they don't have a massive bias, especially consider how this entire Intercept thing went down. They were revealed that their October 7th rape story was complete bullshit. Like, absolutely did not rise to the editorial standards of something we would publish here, let alone over at the New York Times. Well, they then launched an investigation into who leaked all of the background of their terrible reporting. And as Ryan has talked about here, part of the reason he believes that they won't retract it is because they want to win a Pulitzer Prize for that story. They fully believe that they will do. And that, how insane would that be?
I think they're also they're like afraid of the fallout from it. Yeah, they just, I mean, even though, remember, and we've covered this pretty extensively, but their own reporters at the New York Times had to write a story about how one of the central claims of their own Hamas rape story was not true. And yet they have not retracted the story. They put in a little bit of a like parenthetical after that part of the story, but they didn't even take that part of the story out. I mean, and that's just the tip of the iceberg with the problems of that story. But yeah, this gives you some real insight. And I'm not surprised that they said don't use genocide. I'm not surprised that they say don't use ethnic cleansing. But banning, you can't say refugee camps. You can't say Palestine. You can't say occupied territories. Like, this is flying in the face of really standard, acknowledged reality around the world. And they're censoring their own journalists to try to craft a view of the world that is the most friendly possible to the Israeli position. Like, that comes across this could have been written by one of, Bibi's spokespeople ghouls that we see across media. Yeah. This is exactly how they would want this to be framed. And so it was fine back in the immediate aftermath of October 7th for New York Times reporters to be talking about a massacre, a slaughter, et cetera, et cetera. But suddenly when the slaughter was all on the other side, it's, oh, well, this language, this is too emotional. Why are we using these words? Well, why'd you use them back then? If you're gonna not use the word massacre at all or slaughter at all, why was it fine when it was Israelis being slaughtered, but now that it's Palestinians being slaughtered, suddenly those words are too emotional and we should really think twice before we use them.
Look, the Bucha massacre, all right? And I'm not trying to minimize what happened there. That's 458 people who were killed. I mean, the death toll in Gaza is what? Minimum 30K? Yeah. What are we doing here?
Yeah.
The Bucha is supposed to be one of those like massive turning points of that is what, a day of fighting in Gaza? And I mean, let's flip it around. Bucha massacre, October 7th. That's about a third of the death toll on October 7th. It's like, well, which one is a massacre and what's not? What's the cutoff? Is it indiscriminate killing? Is it not? It's just ludicrous the way that, and again, think about the way that Bucha is literally the justification that they say for quote unquote committing genocide and why America should, back the Ukrainians to the hilt. It shows what savages the Russians are and all this. It's just nothing compared to the scale of world events. I'm not minimizing what happened there. I'm just saying you have to put it in a context of broader conflict and about what the barriers and what for U.S. policy should be in response to certain events. And it's just some things are granted massacre status, some are not. Sometimes embassies are embassies, sometimes they're not. It's like that's the problem that we run into.
Sometimes it's a genocide, sometimes, let's be clear, like the case that this is a genocide is much more further advanced and much more grounded than the case against Russia. In terms of, the ICJ finding it plausible, UN Special Rapporteur saying reasonable grounds. Even in terms of public sentiment within the U.S., you have large and increasing majorities, almost a super majority at this point, of Democrats who say, yes, it's a genocide. You have a plurality of independents, and you even have some number of Republicans, especially judging by the ones who were chanting at Trump's rally the other day, who say it's a genocide. So, yeah, you're right, Sarah. If you don't like that word and you just don't want to use it anywhere, okay, but that hasn't been the standard of your coverage at any point anywhere else that we can really point to. There was a really good point that was made by a staffer who spoke to The Intercept about this memo, about banning the use of the term occupied territories. And the staffer was particularly upset about that because they said this obscures the reality of the conflict, feeding into the U.S. and Israeli insistence that the conflict began on October 7th and nothing prior to that context mattered whatsoever. Here's the quote: "You are basically taking the occupation out of the coverage, which is the actual core of the conflict. It's like, oh, let's not say occupation because it might make it look like we're justifying a terrorist attack." So they're so fearful of giving any credence to legitimate Palestinian grievances prior to October 7th that they just obscure the reality of what this conflict is actually about at its core. And that means that they are failing as a news organization if you are not able to make your readers understand what is actually happening here, why this is all unfolding, that this didn't just come out of nowhere. You know, it didn't fall on, what did Kamala say, it didn't fall out of a coconut tree. That this exists in the context of all that came before. If you aren't able to talk to your readers honestly about that, like, what are you even doing as a news organization?
The whole thing is silly. Either treat it fairly or don't. Or, you know, declare your bias up front and then just tell people, but trying to shape it and behind
just put all your Israel coverage under the opinion section. How about that?
Or publish the memo. Publish your guidance. Seriously.
Yeah.
That actually, that's a real justice. Be like, listen, this is the way that we refer to stuff on the conflict, period, end of story, and you can read all of our stories under that editorial. But it has to leak to somebody else about the way that they cover it. That's actually what I find the most objectionable about the entire thing.
They have so disgraced themselves in their coverage. I mean, it really is like WMD caliphate level of failures from the New York Times. It really is, where, you know, they have a narrative that they want, and then they fill in the facts to match that narrative.
Yeah.
That's what we've seen, you know, not 100% of the time, but pretty consistently, and especially when you see the analysis of the different language that was used, and this memo that provides the guidance of how reporters have to talk about this this conflict. It just is all about hiding the ball.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. We appreciate you. Thanks for helping us with the gold plaque. It was very, very kind of you guys to help us get to 1 million, even though it was krystal a long time ago. Krystal will be in on Counterpoints tomorrow, and I will see you guys on Thursday.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.